Ah, okay. Now I see the people who are showing up. Okay,
Mhm.
awesome.
The numbers keep going up, so it looks like people
Yeah,
are still coming on one by one.
right.
I don't know if you meant to, but this is the day after the deadline for the Southeast Colloquium, so reviewing is on my mind.
I know we planned it that way.
So I'm assuming everyone who has signed up is consented to review.
Yes,
That's
majority
actually a very
actually.
bad thing for me to assume. I'll talk about it.
No, 50% of the attendees actually said they would like to review for Southeast Colloquium.
Maybe the other 50% will feel more confident at the end of our session.
Right.
We'll wait a minute or so more for more folks to flow in, and then we'll begin.
This may be the first reviewing webinar to have a cat's perspective.
Right. So maybe that cat is reviewer too.
There you go.
That tracks.
Very important perspective. Oh, yes, thank you.
And are those etchings behind you on the wall?
Oh, they're actually just bargain basement type prints. When we had this house built, the developer had a guy who came around once he knew our colors with things like this to match. So
Oh, well, that's cool.
yeah, that's back when I think it was more common for things to actually match. I think that went out, but my house is still matchy.
Jody, do you want to start maybe introducing our panelists while people still settling in?
Excellent idea. Thank you. So welcome to those of you who are here, and we know there will be folks flowing in the next few minutes, so feel free to jump in and join the conversation. This is the last session of the year, hosted by the Commission for Graduate Education for AEJMC. It is a research webinar, The Art of the Scholarly Critique, so welcome. I'd like to start with an introduction of our two presenters. We're very fortunate to have both of these professionals with us during this hectic time. And then we'll hand over the mic to each of them to give a presentation, and then we'll field questions and have more of a conversation. This session goes until 2:15 today, Eastern Standard Time. I'll start by introducing Dr. Linda Steiner. She is a professor and associate dean for faculty affairs and DEI at the University of Maryland's Philip Merrill College of Journalism. Last year, she was named a distinguished scholar teacher here. She's a fellow of the International Communication Association and has edited 2 journals, Critical Studies in Media Communication, and Journalism and Communication monographs. And she still serves on 8 editorial boards. Her scholarship has gotten both accepted and rejected. She's quite familiar with the editorial process. And secondly, we have Dr. Rhonda Gibson. Dr. Gibson is a professor at UNC Chapel Hill. Dr. Gibson, what's your cat's name?
This is Mac.
And Mac is
Mac
co-presenting with her.
is 15, and he's heard me curse at reviews. That helps.
That does help. Perfect. Dr. Gibson has been at UNC Chapel Hill since 2001. Her current research focuses on public discourse related to LGBTQ+ issues and individuals, with a focus for now on same-sex marriage. She was trained as a quantitative scholar specializing in experimental design. Over the years, she's added more quantitative methods and ventured into qualitative content analysis a time or two. She also directs the journalism master's program at the Hussman School. So we will begin today with Linda presenting, and then we'll move over to Rhonda. Does that sound good? Perfect. Linda, the floor is yours.
Great. All right. So now, how do I get this to expand? I got it before, and is that showing on most of the screen?
It
Can you
looks
see my-
amazing. It is
Oh,
perfect.
okay.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So I put my email right there in case any of you have questions. But there has been over the years the emerging trope of the bitter, nasty, condescending reviewer number two. And so I want to just briefly discuss why you might be willing to be a reviewer one and why you would not want to be reviewer two. So let me just remind you that as graduate students, as newly minted PhDs, and really essentially for the rest of your career as a scholar, peer review is really important to everything that we do. We do peer reviews of teaching, of scholarship, and certainly manuscripts go through a peer review process. Without it, we lack credibility. So this is something that you will continue to be involved in, and that itself is presumably a reason why you would want to learn the skills of peer review and engage in it. Besides that, presumably you want to do service, and service is one of those things that is expected of people, and so that's a reason. Um, but I think it, from a really practical point of view, you'll internalize the standards and the rubrics that tend to be used by journals, by conferences, by special workshops and symposia. Um, and these are skills that actually need practice, so why not start now? And then again, in a way, you sort of learn how the enemy thinks, and you can anticipate that when you're writing and submitting your own research. So I think that there are a lot of advantages for you for doing this, and then again, learning how to do it well and practicing it. But I do want to remind you that there may be some reasons you don't want to do too much of it. It does take a lot of time to do a good job. And if you can't do a good job, then you shouldn't do it at all. It takes a while to figure out what the criteria or the standards are for a particular context, a journal, or again, a conference. Um, and then to write the review, and they really should be done not only responsibly, that is completely and fairly, but also by a deadline. So maybe you can't afford that time. And I have to admit one other thing, which is that although, again, service is important, the service that you do isn't going to count for a huge amount of um, how you are credited for the work that you do, and probably is something that more senior people really are going to be expected to do more of than you as a graduate student. I mean, getting good reviewers, and apparently Rhonda is going to talk about this in the context of the Southeast Colloquium. Getting enough reviewers has always been a problem, and it's getting to be more and more of a problem. I know that as a journal editor, during the pandemic and then since the pandemic, it's just got a lot more difficult to get enough people to write reviews. Some organizations are experimenting with ways to incentivize people stepping up to the plate and doing reviews. But it is a problem, and I can't promise you that the symbolic capital is going to be, again, significant, and there's not going to be financial capital from it. But to get those gold stars, I do have a few do's, things that really are important to doing good peer reviewing. One is to read the whole manuscript before you make any judgment. It's tempting to make a judgment based on the first paragraph, or maybe the abstract, or maybe the first page, and then from then on to read the rest of the manuscript, but looking to justify what you initially decided. But you really shouldn't do it that way. You should really read the whole thing before you make a judgment, and then go back and look for the sort of evidence that will sort of undergird your judgment and also explain to the author or multiple authors what they can do to improve the manuscript, whether you're suggesting revisions or you're suggesting a rejection. It's important, again, to apply the standards that have been set forth by the journal editor or the editorial board, or by the conference system. And usually these days there is some kind of rubric, and to really think about all of the elements of that rubric or all of the standards that are listed, and to do it consistently and across the whole manuscript. And you might think about who the intended reader is, or the intended audience. So some journals are very, very specialized, and so their standards are going to be geared to the person who already knows a lot about the field. But some journals are more kind of flagship journals, and so they are sent to and read by a lot of people who aren't in that specialty. And so what they will need is a manuscript that it kind of explains more and puts more things into context. And so then that's a question for you to think about, well, did the author or authors do that? And then finally, I just want to mention, and this is certainly not a comprehensive list of do's, think about what you can offer to the editor, but also to the authors, about what really can be corrected, what's not really a kind of fatal flaw, versus what is a fundamental problem with the manuscript, and sort of not confuse those two, or treat the latter as the former or the former as the latter. And then lastly, since you don't want to be that nasty, unconstructive, harsh, bitter, condescending, smug reviewer number 2, I mean, this is kind of obvious, but I still think it's worth saying. You don't want to reject a manuscript or attack a manuscript based on your pet peeve. As Jody knows, I have a pet, and Sohana knows too, I have a pet peeve, which is that people refer to someone's sex by using the terms female or male, when they're really talking about gender. But I'm not going to reject or again attack a reviewer who uses the language of female and male, even though they claim to be speaking about gender. These days, I don't even bring it up because I'm the minority opinion on this. So be careful about that. Be careful about assuming that your method, your preferred theory isn't used, and then you're going to attack a manuscript on that basis. It's really important that you critique it on the basis of what the author or authors claim that they were trying to do and what is consistent with the mission and the values of the journal or the conference, even if it's not the way you would have done the research or you would have framed the problem or you would have analyzed or collected data or the way you would have structured the problem. These days with Google, it is sometimes very tempting to try to guess who wrote it, but you shouldn't do that either. It might not affect how you analyze a paper, but it also might. And so it's important that you not try to do that kind of research. I have to say that as I get older and older, I mean, the good thing is I am getting older rather than just dying, but I know that as I get older, I'm getting crankier. But it's also important in the review because it will just kind of undermine your credibility and the ability of you to offer good advice to authors if you are insulting or sarcastic or you used sexist language. Again, sometimes you might think something is just really unredeemable, but you still want to word it in a way that other people are going to respond well to. And we all know that we don't respond well to sarcasm and insults. So do your best to keep that out. And of course, you don't want to sabotage a paper or even seem or appear to sabotage a paper just because you've got something in the works and you think you're going to do it better than the authors. So I hope that I've given you confidence that you can do this, even though, again, you don't want to do too much of it. And we'll see what Rhonda says, and then we'll take your questions.
Thank you for that. That is a fantastic beginning. Rhonda, would you like to take the floor?
Sure. And I don't disagree with anything you said, although I don't think I'm quite as cranky as I was a bit in my mid-career where I was haughty and going to reject this because for one thing, maybe they misspelled Zillman and that was a sin for me. But so let's get past that. What I want to talk about first, I don't have slides, so I'm just going to chat about it. I don't know how many folks on the webinar are grad students or very junior faculty or in some other role, but I want to talk about how you can get reviewing experience at lower stakes rather than jumping in and starting your first reviews as those maybe for your academic journals. And so one of the things that I had the opportunity to do ages ago as a grad student that I know a lot of folks do at classes at UNC is to get the opportunity to review existing journal articles, not one submitted for journals, but they, to critique existing journal articles. Now that's not the same because those journal articles have been through review and published. And if you're likely reading them in a theory class or some other class, they're pretty good. But for the instructors on the call, if you teach courses, you could incorporate this in to maybe find So don't use necessarily seminal works for this assignment, but work, the work that where you think that maybe there is some critique to be done, and assign that, and then have grad students lead those discussions. And so that's a good way to get some practice, and then provide feedback on the reviewing as part of the assignment. Another thing that you can do if you're a emerging reviewer is to ask to co-review with someone. But you have to make sure you get permission from whoever has asked you to do the review. It could be that you just ask a professor or your advisor or just a faculty member, if you've got something to review, can I weigh in, and then you look at my feedback. But you can also, if you want to get credit for your vita, you can also ask to be a literal co-reviewer. That's not common, but you would need to have some area of expertise. But sometimes if you're a grad student studying something, you've got more expertise in the topic than the faculty member reviewing the paper, because that is what you're working on right then. And then if you get permission from that, from whoever's assigned the review, then you can list yourself as a co-reviewer. And I don't think you would even have to list yourself even as a co-reviewer. You could just list yourself as a reviewer, because when you put this on your vita, you certainly do not list the paper you reviewed. You just list the name of the journal that you reviewed for. So I think that's a good way to get a service hit on your vita and to get some practice, and also to, to do something together with a more senior scholar. And then if you have maybe already submitted something and had it reviewed and maybe presented, so you've been through the receiving end of reviews, you might consider asking to review for a regional conference. This is partially self-serving on my part, because I am the research competition chair for the Southeast Colloquium. This is self-serving too, which will be March 13th through 15th in Chapel Hill. The submission deadline is passed. It was yesterday, so you can't submit, but you could certainly attend. But that is something this is a regional conference that was started 50 years ago, primarily to give graduate students the opportunity to present their work in maybe a less stressful situation, less intense situation. And then we have an agreement with the main AEJMC conference that you can submit at the colloquium, revise your work, and then submit it. Again, normally you cannot submit and present something to the same something to two conferences. But this, the colloquium and the midwinter meeting, the Midwinter Regional Conference, that I think is still always in Oklahoma, has the same agreement. And so asking to, I wouldn't do this unless you've had work reviewed, but asking to, or volunteering to review for the conference. And then you can just talk to the division head chair. That's who you would contact if you want to review. So I don't mean to be condescending and explaining this, but just to make sure everybody's on the same page. Conferences are usually, at least in our field, are usually run by organizations that have divisions. Sometimes a conference is just focused on one thing, like media history or media law. Or if it's a one-off, maybe on a more narrow topic. But the annual ones are usually run by divisions. For the colloquium, it's newspaper and online, and history and law, LGBTQ. I'm missing magazine. The first one that the first colloquium that the new Commission on Graduate Education is among the groups. Well, anyhow, and we also have an open division, sort of catch-all. And so contact the person who's the research head of that, and volunteer to review. So those are my tips for getting some review experience. But I also want to talk about a little more about, Linda touched on this some, but how to prepare to review. And I think as you move into mid-career or later in your career, what you need to do, rather than focus on getting review experience, is becoming a really good reviewer in a pretty specific area, and then doing everything you can to make yourself available in that area, but not so much spread around. And I think, and Linda, if you really are on 8 editorial boards, oh my goodness, that is a lot of expected work, let me tell you. But one of the things about sitting on an editorial board is that you know that journal inside and out. You go to meetings, at conferences, you know what the standards are, you know what the trends are, how the journal has changed. So I think it's really important, especially if you're reviewing for journals where the stakes are a little higher, the expectations are higher for the quality of the review, is that you fully understand the scope of the journal. I regularly get asked to review by journals I'm not familiar with, and I've gotten to where I turn them down. An exception would be if there was a new journal in the LGBTQ space that wasn't critical. I'm not a critical scholar. So if it was more on the empirical side and something in that space, I would learn that journal because that's where I want to focus my efforts. But so the scope of the journal, you can read what's on the website, but that's not going to tell you enough to know whether that is a good place for you to review. So I wrote some notes I jotted down is what are the thematic areas? Because sometimes you can't tell by the name of the journal or even the scope. What are the thematic areas? But then what are the methodological preferences? I have dabbled a bit in qualitative research, but I am much more effective as a quantitative work reviewer. And so I've learned, even within some journals I review for, to make sure they know what my preferences are. And most journal editors now, when you submit something to be reviewed, they ask you as part of what you do when you submit, what are your areas of expertise methodologically, topically, and then they add you to the review list, and then they might ask you if you would review, and I recommend you say yes if it's a journal you're going to be submitting to a good bit. It's not exactly quid pro quo, but it's just good form. If you're asking the journal to review your work, to be willing to review for that journal, even if your work is not always accepted by the journal. But I would talk to the journal editor and say, what are the main things you reject papers for? And to try to get a sense of what they're not looking for. I've gotten pretty selective, and I try to review just for journals now where the editors are very active with desk review rejects. So a desk reject is not fun to receive. It's not a pleasant thing. It's when the editor doesn't even send your work out for review, looks over the work at the beginning, editor or associate editor, and determine that it doesn't fit the journal, or maybe that it just really isn't strong enough to be sent out for review. I like a rigorous process that way. Now, I understand that's painful to get, but it's so much better if you get within a week a desk reject than if somebody sends your work out and 4 or 5, 6, 8 months later, you get reviewers who say this just doesn't fit, or this isn't, there's enough that needs improvement that it's just not high quality enough. I've gotten some really helpful desk rejects where they explain why. Not the same as a review, but just some, big picture. And so that is something that that you can learn more about. And if you're willing to sign on as an editorial board member or just willing to volunteer to review for a journal, it's good to know these things. What is the intended audience? Linda mentioned that. I've reviewed for, what is it now? It's been Newspaper Research Journal for years. It's News Research Journal now, I think, right? Took out the paper because there isn't any paper anymore. But that is a journal where the audience is intended to straddle academia and the profession. And so I would need to know that in order to review for that journal if it is really, really heavy, wonky, and just, for folks who've maybe never set foot in a newsroom, the ones that still exist, then, maybe it doesn't fit that journal, where it might fit something like Mass Common Society really well. And then geographical focus. One of the things I've noticed is that more and more journals are notably and nobly trying to expand their geographic focus outside the US. And so that's something that if your work does that, it's really good to know which journals are prioritizing that. It might give you more of a chance of having your work accepted, or if it is a journal that has an international focus and yours is very, very US centric only, and it's a topic that really could benefit from a more international focus, you might have less of a chance. So those are some things that I think you can find out about the scope of a journal, what what type of work it accepts, what its area of focus. Some are very narrow purposefully, and that might help you. When I was, before I was on the faculty at Carolina, I taught at Texas Tech, and there was a Southwest Communication Journal, I believe, and I think it's still around. And the faculty there were committed to doing work for that journal and research on the Southwest and emerging issues. And so that was new to me. I wasn't taught about those things in grad school. And so that was really a plus to find out about. The last thing, just a couple more minutes, I'm going to talk about something that may get me fussed at a bit, but that I'm really thinking about as we're going to start soliciting reviews for the colloquium. This is the first time I've run something in a year. So the last time I was research chair, something was a year ago. That doesn't seem that long, but my guess is very few of the reviews I received a year ago were written solely by or even mostly by AI. And I expect that, I'm probably not going where you think I'm going, but I expect that a number of the reviews that I'll see and that other, the division research chairs for the colloquium will see are reviews that were influenced by AI, if not outright written by AI. And so that's something I think we need to talk about in our field. And so what I've done for the last couple days while I was waiting for these things to come in and start sending out for review is that I plugged some journal articles in and started with just review this for me. I teach prompt engineering in one of my classes, and so how to write prompts specifically for what you want. So I started with this just awful prompt, review this paper to me, and then got more specific and explained the outlet and all of these things. And I asked I was using ChatGPT 4.0. And I asked ChatGPT, what are you good for? What are you not good for in this area? And we don't have any guidelines for the colloquium about this. I'm actually fine with that. I think it's something that we ought to have a panel session on in the colloquium, and we still have time to do that. But that's something that I actually think one way you can help avoid being reviewer too is to use AI, if nothing else, to help you be more constructive in how you word things. I don't have a problem with the ethics of that. Now, that does, if you were saying that the method section is awful, there's not a way that you're going to get real constructive, but maybe ask ChatGPT to look at the paper. I think the method section is very weak. What recommendations would you make for improving it? And then this is the key. You have to agree with that and be agreeing knowledgeably. That's where I think you're doing a disservice if you just take it and run. Yeah, who knows and if you don't know whether the critique from AI is good or not, you really shouldn't be reviewing that paper. So I will end with that. I hope I didn't stir up a hornet's nest. And I've got, y'all sent out some questions in advance, and I jotted down some notes for the questions, but rather than go through that, I'd rather just see what questions people have, if that's okay.
That's fantastic. I didn't expect you to go there, but I'm glad that you did. That'll be a rich vein of conversation for us. As I'm waiting to see if folks want to drop some questions into the webinar chat, we do have some questions from folks who signed up and submitted questions at that time. So I'll ask some of those as we wait for live questions to come in. One of those is, how long do you think a review should take? Clearly, the two of you are quite experienced and probably pretty fast given that. But if a grad student is reviewing and is less experienced, how long is an appropriate amount of time for you to expect them to allocate, and how would they use it? I'll let either of you, it's a jump ball. How about that?
Okay. Before I answer that question, although I will, I just wanted to piggyback on a point that Rhonda made about being like a shadow reviewer or a co-reviewer. I believe that Journalism and Mass Communication Quarterly, the flagship organization or journal of AEJ, has a co-reviewing structure specifically to enable PhD students to get involved in reviewing. So you could contact Anitza or look on the website about that. I think that process started 2 or 3 years ago, and I don't know much about it. I mean, I do a lot of reviewing for JQ, and I'm on that board, but I haven't been asked to co-review something, but I'm pretty sure. To that question, I do admit that I spend a lot more time writing reviews of manuscripts that I think have a good chance of being successfully revised and resubmitted and then getting published. And I spend maybe less time when I think that the manuscript is essentially dead in the water, but didn't get the desk reject that Rhonda talked about. So I would say on the manuscripts where, again, I think it's worthwhile giving a lot of feedback because then it could be used to really improve the manuscript. I think I spend maybe 4 or 5 hours per review.
Okay. 4 to 5 hours per review, assuming it's not a sort of a delayed desk rejectable review. Sure. That's helpful. How about you, Rhonda? What do you think?
I would say it depends on the type of article. There are times when I'll accept a review of an article because when you're asked to review, the title of the article and usually a little bit about it. So you'll know the methodology. And sometimes I'll accept something that I'm really intrigued by, or it's slightly within my area, but maybe I don't know the literature as well. And so then I usually look at some of the main pieces cited and do a little reading of that just to become more familiar with it. My work's moving a little bit now into religion space, and so I'm more willing to spend time reviewing those areas because that's a learning process for me too. So I'm sort of double dipping with that time. So that might take me a little more. There are times though that I think especially if it's an extended abstract. Now I know we're talking about full papers, but if it's an extended abstract, I can sometimes knock those out in a couple hours if it's within my area. It depends on again, there's always an asterisk. So I would say maybe a minimum of 2 hours up to 5 or so.
Yeah, and
Very good.
I just want to follow up on that. Certainly, if I'm reviewing for a conference, ICA or AEJ primarily, I mean, first of all, the problem is I get 4, 5, or 6 papers, and I have 3 weeks to read them, and it's the busiest time of the semester. If it's ICA, and so I whip those off in an hour each, or maybe less. I mean, it's a short paper. It's not a fully fleshed out paper. Again, I'm primarily giving very sketchy responses and then filling in numbers on a rubric. But there's no way I can spend the same amount of time when I've gotten 5 or 6 papers and I have 3 weeks to do it, as opposed to a journal, which usually will give me 6 weeks or 8 weeks to do it, and it's just one paper.
That makes perfect sense. So I don't want to make an assumption about the methodological persuasions for each of you, but is there a difference in terms of approach if you're reviewing something that is qualitative versus something that is quantitative? And to each of you, do you feel comfortable reviewing in both spaces? We'll start with Rhonda. I know you're our quantitative
Yeah,
my
I am,
training.
although some of those skills have atrophied and I didn't learn some of the newer skills. So, well, that's maybe now I'll get asked to review less since I said that. But for example, I am not a computational scholar. I'm married to one, and that's a convenient co-author. So, so if I will sometimes, and I have publications that are computational, but they're not sole author, right? So sometimes I'm asked to review something computational, and I've just gotten to where I don't know if this is going to sound bad, both personally and professionally, but I ask my husband to look at that part. It's his area of expertise. He's a faculty member too, and I don't give him co-author or co-review credit. Okay, this is being recorded too. So anyhow, I'm comfortable doing that, even though I'm not in that space. I know what those methods are good for and what their limitations are, but that's not the same as me being able to critique that. And those are changing so much, the large language models and various things. So but I'm much more comfortable now with something like a qualitative content analysis or focus groups, as long as it's not shifting over to a critical approach. I just don't go there, and I don't want to critique that because I'm not situated there. So what I won't accept is something that is maybe in the journal of, what's the methods journal? It's not new anymore, but that's where I won't accept, because I am not a methodologist. That's not my main area of expertise. So I won't go there, but because I usually focus so much more of my efforts on the literature review, on the theory, and then how are they framing those findings and the contribution to the field. And I look at the stuff in the middle, but that is not my main area of expertise. And so I try not to get too far outside of the lane that I know enough about to comment on.
And it's maybe okay to phone a friend is what I'm getting.
Or to say no.
Yeah.
I have occasionally unsaid yes after I've looked at a paper and realized that, one, I don't want to take the time to phone a friend or whatever, or my husband's finally saying, no, maybe you should do your own job. But so sometimes I say, I promise I'll do the next one that fits me better, but I'm going to have to return this one to the shelter.
So honesty is a better policy than winging it.
And you can do that if you're established, if you said yes enough. I think you can do that respectfully. So.
Fair. Linda.
And I mean, I agree with everything that Rhonda said, although my partner is not a backup on an academic reviewing of journal submissions or conference papers. But what I think is an important lesson here, consistent with one of the first points I made on that early slide about the advantages of reviewing, that you learn how your own work is going to be reviewed by others. So the fact that when reviewers are invited to review something, what they get is the title and the abstract. I mean, just about all the journals are using Scholar One now. And so Scholar One just imports the abstract into the invitation. But my point here is that what we learn from this is the importance of writing a good abstract. Because if you don't write a good abstract, then that means that your paper might seem doable by a potential reviewer who's invited and who accepts the invitation. And then the person looks at it when they finally do it in the 3 days before it's due, and says, oh, wow, this is not at all what I expected to get. And now I really can't do it. And then has to say to the editor, wow, this is not really as advertised. I can't do it. And now you've, delayed the process. or you're getting just less effective feedback from the reviewers. So again, the advantage of doing the reviews in general is that you learn the whole system by which your own work is going to be evaluated, as well as the service that you really provide given your expertise. But just to come back to the actual question, I do not agree to review highly quantitative manuscripts.
Mhm. Just stay where you know you'll make the most impact.
Like Rhonda, I stay in my lane.
Makes sense. Makes perfect sense. We have a question from Aubrey Huber here. She says, as a journal or a book editor or a conference planner, how do you approach reviews that come in from sort of that stereotypical reviewer number 2? So that might be insulting or might engage in some reviewing don'ts. How do you handle that as the supervisor of that work?
I actually would probably go ahead and use it. It depends on what the 2-ish material is. If it's harsh criticism of the work, I'll include it. And even if I don't think it's very good harsh criticism of the work, if it's marginalizing the topic somewhat, I still might take it. But if it gets into something that I consider offensive, commenting on the topic, or implying something really bad about the authors, I might just decline it and and let the reviewer know. The problem with that, especially if it's for a journal, you would probably need then to spend a little more time getting another reviewer, and that's not so great. For a conference, it's easier to get a reviewer quicker. And maybe, or just go with 2 reviews if you have 2 others. I think I don't think we should try to insulate ourselves from that. I think we should not try not to be it, but we're not going to live in a world necessarily without it. And so if there's anything constructive to find from it, I hope people will. But one thing I would do, whether it's for a conference or a journal, I would, because you have the opportunity in both places to write comments for the authors. I might say, reviewer 2, or maybe it's reviewer 1, reviewer 3, whatever, maybe overly harsh here. What I hope your takeaway is blah. And I hope that would soften some of the harshness, but still let folks know that it's going to be out there. This is where I do see myself getting a little crankier as I age, is that I'm not trying to shield people from the harshness of this type of thing. The world isn't always kind to you, and we can still get up and keep going.
Fair enough.
And get off my lawn.
That's right. Exactly.
Oh, the name of the cat is Mac, by the way. Mac, M-A-C.
This is reviewer 4.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, it was just asked in the chat. I just didn't just suddenly come up with that. But I'm sorry. Okay, Linda, what do you think about that question, or another question?
Yeah, well, I think it is a problem. I mean, I'm kind of with Rhonda on not wanting to excessively protect people from harsh criticism, or at least stern criticism. On the other hand, I've seen people really be just irate about what they consider to be offensive reviews, and then go above my head as a editor, or if in terms of the journals where I'm an editorial board member. I know that people have criticized to other editors and to the publication committees of scholarly organizations that kind of supervise and sponsor those journals. So It is a problem. I definitely endorse Rhonda's suggestion, and this is something that I always do as an editor. I don't just say to an author, here are the 2 reviews or the 3 reviews of your manuscript, and here's the decision, and if it's revised and resubmit, pay attention. I always add my own thoughts. So I become the 3rd reviewer, the 4th reviewer, 5th, whatever it is. But when I disagree with either the language or the substance of the review, I comment on that. And a lot of times the reviews are inconsistent, sometimes even incompatible. So, to please reviewer 1, you're going to actually alienate reviewer 2 and vice versa. So I think it's my responsibility as an editor to anticipate that problem and deal with it in my commentary. But I will say that the best practices of COPE, the Commission on Publishing Ethics, and AEJMC and ICA are both signatories to COPE, and so we have to essentially be consistent with what they consider best practices, say that unless the language of a review is really off the wall, inappropriate, and offensive, that editors should not change the language. I mean, it's very tempting, again, because Scholar One, besides when they invite a review, or when an editor uses the system to invite a review, incorporates the abstract. Scholar One also, when the reviews have all been submitted, incorporates all of the reviews into the body of the text that the editor then uses to write the editor's comments and announce the decision. And there's kind of a template for that. So believe me, it's very tempting sometimes, and it would be very easy to just change the language of the reviewer, but that really is not ethical. And so I'm assuming that editors don't do that. So that's why sometimes there is this inconsistency in what reviewers say, and sometimes sarcastic and bitter or really aggressive language sometimes gets in there and stays in there.
That's helpful, pulling the curtain back for us. Thank you. Probably most of us have not been on either side of Scholar One at this point, so this is good stuff. I'm thinking both of you probably, and it may be a little much to think of an example, a specific example, but both of you can probably remember a time or many times when a review didn't really serve you. And I'm wondering if you can share in broad strokes, if you'd like, or specifics, why it wasn't helpful to you, and then how you remember that pain when you try to do something better or different when you're doing reviews. Do either of you feel comfortable jumping on that?
Well, mine usually was them suggesting a different study, or especially back in my when almost exclusively experimental days. Well, you should have done this. And there's not something, that's not an inappropriate suggestion, that maybe this measure would have been better than that measure, but, and this was before the days of Prolific and other platforms where it was pretty easy to just run a few more participants, right? But even so, I mean, that, I would have preferred the comments to focus on was what I did good or not good, appropriate, inappropriate, are the conclusions sound, as opposed to what you should have. Now, if the overall judgment is that this does not contribute enough. There's something, it's not theoretically driven, or the theory and the measures don't match, or the measures are outdated or something. Then they might suggest, if you do have the ability to run more participants, this is what I recommend. And that would be helpful. But just, saying that I would have done this, or, you should have, it's more interesting to have gone this direction. It's like, so that I don't find those very helpful at all. And then sometimes, and I don't know if what I'm about to say is right or not, but it is how I felt at times with, if wanted me to go in a little, more different, like a political approach to this, or which I really try to stay away from, even though a lot of the topics I look at are inherently political. The approach I'm taking to them isn't connected to electoral politics as much. And so I've chosen not to go that way. And I've tried to select journals or divisions that aren't going that way. But sometimes you still get reviewers who that's their area. And I don't necessarily find that as helpful because I chose not to, but it's a learning experience for me. And especially if they mention specifics, then maybe I can, maybe, yeah, actually I can grow a bit and learn something new. But those are the things that come to mind for your question.
That's helpful. Thank you. I think we've all probably experienced you wrote about bicycles, but I'd rather read about cats kind of review. So that is helpful. Thank you. Linda, does anything come to mind?
Well, just recently, an article that I wrote with 2 graduate students. We'd gotten the feedback from the reviewers, and the editor then said revise and resubmit. And our problem was that there were 2 reviewers, and they each wanted a lot more about something, but they were different things. And so one person wanted a lot more about X and said, I think you should incorporate the following 20 citations. And sure enough, there was a list of 20 citations. And then the other reviewer said, I'd like a lot more about why, and here's some relevant citations. And it was another 8. And we were ready just within 1 word of the word maximum. And so there was no way we could write a credible revision that would stay within the word limit and satisfy these 2 reviewers. And so we actually did ask the editor, and the editor essentially said, well, do your best. So we found that incredibly frustrating. And what we really wanted to do in our letter of response was say, we just can't expand as much as we'd like to. So we had to actually take out a lot of precious data, like great anecdotes and great examples in order to incorporate all of this literature. But I can tell you, our thinking, and don't you dare, any of you, quote me on this. You did not hear this from me.
It is being recorded.
Okay, well, still, don't quote me. So we tried to satisfy the 2 reviewers. We took out a lot of things that we thought were really, really important to satisfy the reviewers, and we explained, what we did in our letter of response to the reviewers. And our theory is that then we'll get a decision by the editor. We hope that it will pass muster. And then when the editor says, okay, now prepare the final copy, we're going to take out half that stuff and put back in what we wanted. But You didn't hear that from me.
It never happened. Thank you. Those are great examples. Thank you so much. Is there anything when you're looking at a paper where you go, oh, this automatically is a disqualification? Is there any sort of a flag that goes up for you when you're reviewing that sort of short circuits that process for you?
There's some things you can do methodologically and statistically that are pretty basically wrong, that might, yeah, I think. And now I have started plugging all references into Google Scholar, or asking a grad student to do it just to make sure they exist, because I know that I know what AI is good for, but what it's not necessarily so good for, and that I may be looking at things that have, so if references don't exist, then I stop and report it to whatever entity I can report it to. Not if there's a typo, if they got the wrong year, but if they don't exist, or if they're attributed to the wrong authors, I at least investigate that. I had a grad student who was wanting to do a guest lecture in one of my news writing classes about using AI. And this was a few years, maybe 2-3 years ago, when we were just starting to talk about this so much. And he, at the time, was using it to do some references for his own paper. And he was citing a paper my husband and I wrote, and he asked for the citation in APA style. It gave it to him with 2 different authors, 2 people who weren't us. And then he asked about are you sure? And it was ChatGPT 3.0 or something. And yes. And so he used that. I mean, he used that as in my guest lecture as an example of a hallucination. But what if he hadn't known? He had read the work, but didn't write the citation down, just maybe the title, figured he'd get that from, he should have used Google Scholar or RefWorks or something. But so that's something that will flag for me. Then we're going to start seeing more of, unfortunately, I think.
Yeah, here I'm thinking about content, but you're all the way at the citation saying, actually, you could start at the back in a way.
Yeah, because that's where some of the hallucinations will show up.
Mm-hmm.
And what I would say, Jody, is that for me, the fundamental question is, did the authors answer the so what question? And the so what isn't a matter of what's interesting to me. Actually, I'm just now doing a review of something that was sent to me by a journal, and the author justifies the topic by saying it's fascinating to think about this issue, which the author describes. And I just can't understand why no one else has ever written about it. And I'm thinking, well, that's really not the answer to the so what question. The fact that it's fascinating to you and no one else has ever written about it doesn't mean that it's important. But I also will concede that the answer to the so what question is partly a matter of, again, what the context is and what the audience is. So something that is for a regional journal, that specializes in Southwest history, or, it specializes in things about Iowa, and there are journals that are state journals, the Iowa State Journal of Communication or something like that. You know, it might be appropriate for that journal, but not for Journalism Quarterly, which just doesn't have the space to deal with a little niche question that only looks at Iowa news coverage of some Iowa issue in 1949. So again, I'm willing to take seriously how the answer to the so what question varies from context to context, but it still has to answer the so what question.
Very good, very good. We have a question from Joey Chen in the chat. She's asking how you should handle situations where you suspect ethical concerns like plagiarism or fabricated data, but you don't necessarily have proof. What do you do in that situation?
I have a classic example from when I was the editor of Critical Studies in Media Communication, which is a NCA journal. I got a paper submitted by two co-authors. I wasn't really sure who to send it to, but I did some Googling and I sent it to a couple of people, and one person reviewed it and sent it back. And that person actually wasn't in academia, was working for the World Bank. But I had sent it to the person because his dissertation seemed very close to the topic. And this person sent me back this very, very long, very, very detailed list of, I don't know, like 18 reasons why this paper should be rejected. And reason 14 was that it was plagiarized. And so I immediately wrote back to the reviewer and said, well, how do you know it was plagiarized? And the reviewer said, it was plagiarized on my dissertation. So that's how I knew to answer that part of Joey's question. And then what did I do? I mean, it turns out that I had to go through the publication board of NCA. So it wasn't just my call, it was the publication committee. And again, AEJ and ICA also have publication committees. Of course, there are a lot of journals that are very good, like journalism theory, what is it? Theory, practice, application, I can't remember. That is published by a publisher, but does not have a scholarly association that hosts it. And so there is no publications committee. So then the editors have to do their own thing. In this case, it was hundreds of hours for me to deal with what the publication committee then asked, because it asked me, well, you know, do I actually explicitly ask authors to warrant that they did not plagiarize their article? And do I know who plagiarized what? And these were not easy things that involved research. And then the publications committee actually wrote to complaints to the universities of the two co-authors. And so then I had to answer to the ethics board, to the department chair, and to the college deans of both those co-authors. So by the time I was done with this, I wish I'd never agreed to be editor. I mean, I just can't tell you what a pain in the butt it was. But it's one of the things that we do. I mean, that's just part of being in academia, is that we check for this, we take it very seriously, and we engage in some actions when we suspect or we know.
Wow, that is a nightmare scenario, is what that is. Rhonda, would you like to answer that question?
I've dealt with small issues for over the years. I know there have been a couple times when I've made typos in especially in page numbers or something. And what's interesting is, and then if somebody points it out to you, it's kind of seared in your mind. Oh, you know, especially if you teach news writing, you make a mistake and yeah, you're just. But then if you see that show up in somebody else's article where you know they just sort of cut and pasted out of yours without really looking, I'll point that out in a review, that says, I get a sense from this that you did not actually look at the original something, and I recommend that you do because the ethics, and just so that you really know that you agree with what the summary was that you used from somebody else's work. Or if it's maybe somebody who's not as good yet at writing a lit review where they attribute in the right place. And so maybe it'll have 4 paragraphs of pretty much all the stuff, maybe not word for word exactly, but a lot of it, and just 1 citation in there. I don't necessarily think of that as someone trying to pass off somebody else's work, but it's certainly not appropriately cited. So then that's where I would put in the review that this is not acceptable. And here's what you need to do. 1, not just have half your lit review essentially cut and pasted from somebody else, even if you stick their name in there once. I've only a couple times thought that there might be something a little too neat about the data. That's both times have been in journal situations, and so I just punted it to the editor. I wasn't the editor, I was just a reviewer. And so I recommend that you ask for the data sets. And I haven't yet reviewed anything where I've seen hallucinations. I've had students turn some stuff in where I talked to them about it, but I haven't reviewed where I've seen that. I'm not sure. And gosh, as the research chair for the colloquium, we might really need to be thinking about what I'm going to do if somebody sends me that. But so
That's a problem for tomorrow, perhaps.
yes.
Very good.
Yes,
Good.
indeed.
Excellent. Well, I think we're going to begin to wrap up because we want to be respectful of everyone's time. There's so much more we would love to learn about this topic from the 2 of you. I will remind those who are attending that AEJ shares these recordings on YouTube on its education channel. So this will
Now
eventually.
you're telling me. Now I know why I shouldn't have admitted, but we're
I'm
planning.
sure that everything you were saying was hypothetical, and we're good for sure. So I thank the both of you. Are there any parting thoughts before we sign off that either of you would like to make sure that you share? You've got a hungry audience of young reviewers here.
I have just one thing. Very short. It was one of the questions that were asked. How do you get reviewers for conferences? Most conferences now in the program or somewhere they're thanking reviewers from the previous year. So punish those people for their service by asking them to review again from year to year. I think you're more likely to get a yes, and it's an easy place to get names. So that's it. Sorry, Linda, go ahead.
That's helpful. And maybe we want our names in there too for credit.
Yeah, well, right. I mean, I do think it's a great thing to do. It can really help you and help you be a better writer and researcher when you look at it from the perspective of reviewing. I just don't think you want to overcommit given the time that it takes. So, like in everything, there is a certain virtue to moderation.
Yes, to do it well means to take time to do it, for sure.
Thank you, Jody. You were a very pleasant moderator, and I see Patrick's on the panel. I want to congratulate everybody involved with the Commission on Graduate Education, whether you're still a graduate student or not. It's just amazing what this former interest group has accomplished, and so it's an honor to be here with you all.
Well, thank you so much for those kind words. It is our honor to have the both of you. Thank you on behalf of the Commission on Graduate Education.
My
Thank you.
pleasure, my pleasure. And again, Jody, you did a great job.
And thanks y'all for asking about Mac the cat.
Yes, it's a beautiful cat for sure. All right.
Take
Thanks
care.
again, all.
Okay, bye.